September 12, 1918. Somiel Salient, France, 0100 hours. Gefreiter Klaus Reinhardt had been awake for 32 hours straight, not by choice, by necessity. The rumor had been circulating through the trenches for 3 days. The Americans were coming. Not the small American units they'd faced before, scattered among French divisions, but an entire army. American divisions, American commanders, American everything. Reinhardt didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. Relieved because the Americans were supposedly inexperienced, green troops who'd barely seen combat. Terrified because there were so many of them, and because the artillery preparation everyone expected hadn't come. That was the unsettling part. When the French attacked, you knew. Days of bombardment, methodical and predictable. Time to move reserves, reinforce positions, prepare for the assault. But now, in the pre-dawn darkness of September 12th, the American sector had been eerily quiet for hours. Reinhardt checked his watch. 0100 hours. He was just reaching for his canteen when the world ended. Not gradually, not with the building crescendo of a traditional barrage. The American guns opened simultaneously. 2,971 artillery pieces firing as one, their shells arriving in the same microsecond across a 40-mile front. The sound wasn't individual explosions, but a single continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Reinhardt's dugout collapsed within 90 seconds, not from a direct hit, from the cumulative shockwaves of shells landing every few yards, the ground itself becoming fluid, beams splintering, sandbags bursting. He found himself buried to the waist in soil, ears bleeding, unable to hear anything but a high-pitched ringing. When he finally clawed his way to the surface 40 minutes later, the trench system he'd known for 6 months had ceased to exist. In its place, a moonscape of overlapping craters, shattered equipment, and the remains of his company. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. Not 4 hours of scattered shelling, 4 hours of continuous fire at a rate and precision that Reinhardt's 4 years on the Western Front hadn't prepared him for. This wasn't artillery harassment. This was obliteration. At 0500 hours, the barrage lifted and rolled forward exactly 100 meters, and the American infantry appeared through the smoke like ghosts, moving behind the curtain of explosions with mechanical timing. Reinhardt tried to raise his rifle. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Around him, the survivors of his platoon, maybe 8 men from 40, stood with weapons lowered, faces blank with shock. When the Americans reached the trench line, most of Reinhardt's unit simply raised their hands. He'd survived Verdun. He'd survived the Somme. He'd survived 4 years of hell on earth. But this was something different. This was the sound of the German army breaking. To understand what happened at Somiel, and 3 weeks later at Meuse-Argonne, you must first understand the problem American artillery faced in 1918. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the U.S. Army numbered approximately 127,000 men. By the time of Somiel in September 1918, it had expanded to over 2 million soldiers in France. This expansion created a crisis. The American artillery branch was a catastrophe. The U.S. entered the war with exactly 0 modern artillery pieces suitable for Western Front combat. American artillery doctrine was based on the Spanish-American War, mobile guns providing direct fire support for advancing infantry. This was obsolete by approximately 15 years. The Western Front required massed indirect fire. Hundreds of guns firing from concealed positions miles behind the lines, delivering precisely calculated barrages onto targets they couldn't see. It required sophisticated fire control, mathematical calculations accounting for weather, projectile variations, barrel wear, and a dozen other variables. It required the industrial capacity to produce millions of shells and the logistical infrastructure to deliver them. America had none of this. Colonel Conrad Lanza, who served in the American Artillery Branch, later wrote, "We arrived in France with enthusiasm, manpower, and industrial potential. We arrived without guns, without doctrine, without training, and without the faintest conception of modern artillery warfare. We were children playing at war while veteran armies demonstrated the mathematics of death." The French provided the guns, 75mm field guns and 155mm howitzers. Excellent weapons. But weapons alone don't make artillery effective. The U.S. Army needed to solve a more fundamental problem: command and control. Traditional American artillery doctrine assigned guns to infantry divisions, each division controlling its own fire support. This decentralized approach meant that at any given point, maybe 20 to 30 guns could be concentrated. Adequate for colonial warfare, pathetically inadequate for the Western Front, where German positions were defended by deep belts of trenches, concrete bunkers, interlocking machine gun positions, and their own massed artillery. The solution came from an unexpected source: a 38-year-old lieutenant colonel named George Marshall, who'd never commanded artillery in his life. George Catlett Marshall, future Chief of Staff, future Secretary of State, future architect of post-World War II Reconstruction, was in 1918 a staff officer with a reputation for two things: brilliant organizational ability and a complete intolerance for incompetence. General Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, assigned Marshall to plan the St. Mihiel offensive. Not because Marshall knew artillery, but because Marshall understood systems. Marshall studied the problem with the methodical intensity that would later characterize his entire career. He traveled to British and French headquarters, interviewed artillery commanders, examined fire plans for major offensives, analyzed success and failure patterns. He spent weeks with French artillery officers learning their mathematics, their communication procedures, their hard-won lessons from 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter. What Marshall discovered was revolutionary for American forces. Artillery effectiveness didn't scale linearly. It scaled exponentially when properly coordinated. 30 guns firing independently might suppress a trench line. 300 guns firing in coordination could destroy an entire defensive sector. But coordination required centralized control, standardized procedures, precise timing, and real-time communication across dozens of batteries spread over miles. It meant stripping divisional commanders of their organic fire support and placing it under corps artillery officers who would coordinate fire for everyone. It meant creating a communication network that could transmit fire orders to hundreds of batteries simultaneously. It meant developing fire plans so precise that infantry could advance within 100 yards of falling shells without being hit by their own artillery. It meant, in short, transforming American artillery from a collection of individual batteries into a single, integrated weapon system. The officer Marshall chose to execute this vision was Brigadier General Edward Ned McLachlan, a career artilleryman who'd spent years studying German and French artillery methods. McLachlan understood what Marshall was proposing and understood the resistance it would generate. Division commanders won't surrender their artillery without a fight. They'll argue it violates combined arms doctrine, that it leaves infantry without responsive fire support. Marshall's response was characteristically blunt. Then they can explain to General Pershing why they value command prerogatives over American lives. We've watched the French and British waste hundreds of thousands of men in uncoordinated offensives. We're not repeating their mistakes.
The fire plan McLaughlin developed for Samuel was unlike anything the American Army had attempted. First, mass. McLaughlin concentrated 2,971 guns, roughly one gun for every 25 yards of front. This included every available American artillery piece, plus French heavy guns loaned for the operation. The sheer density was overwhelming, more guns per mile than the Germans had used at Verdun. Second, surprise. Traditional Western Front offensives announced themselves days in advance through lengthy preliminary bombardments. This allowed defenders to bring up reserves and prepare for the attack. McLaughlin reversed this logic: no preliminary bombardment. Complete silence until H-hour, then every gun firing simultaneously. Third, precision. Each battery received detailed firing tables calculated for their specific position and target. These calculations accounted for temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, propellant temperature, barrel wear, and projectile variations. French liaison officers provided the expertise, but American officers learned quickly. Fourth, coordination. The barrage followed a precise timeline: 4 hours of intense fire on German frontline positions and communication trenches. Then, the barrage would lift, shifting forward in 100-meter increments every 4 minutes. Infantry would advance directly behind this moving wall of explosions, closing with German positions while defenders were still stunned. Fifth, counter-battery fire. A portion of American guns, primarily heavy 155mm pieces, targeted German artillery positions exclusively. The goal? Silence German guns before they could fire on advancing American infantry. This required excellent intelligence on German battery positions, careful coordination to avoid duplicate targeting, and the mathematical precision to hit positions miles behind enemy lines. The plan required printing and distributing thousands of pages of firing tables, coordinating telephone wire laying to connect hundreds of batteries to central fire direction centers, stockpiling millions of shells in forward ammunition dumps, and training thousands of artillerymen in procedures most had never practiced. Captain Harry Truman, future president, commanded Battery D, 129th Field Artillery Regiment during Samuel. His letters home described the preparation. We spent 2 weeks doing nothing but calculations and rehearsals. Every man in the battery had to know the drill perfectly. The firing tables were so complex I thought I'd need a mathematics degree. The French liaison officer just kept saying, "Précision, précision," until I wanted to strangle him. But he was right. Everything depended on every battery firing exactly according to schedule. September 12, 1918, 0100 hours. The sound of 2,971 guns firing simultaneously was audible in Paris 170 miles away. At the front, it was beyond human sensory processing, a physical pressure that stopped breath, that turned bowels liquid, that made hardened veterans curl into fetal positions praying for it to stop. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, German writer and combat veteran, was in a reserve position 5 miles behind the lines. His memoir describes the moment. The horizon became a continuous sheet of flame, not individual muzzle flashes, a wall of fire extending as far as the eye could see in both directions. The sound reached us seconds later, not individual explosions, but a sustained roar like a great beast. The ground trembled continuously. We knew then that something had fundamentally changed in this war. The American fire plan targeted 3 distinct zones simultaneously. Zone 1, frontline trenches, high explosive shells from 75mm guns fired at maximum rate. Goal: destroy defensive positions, cut barbed wire, kill defenders, and create total shock effect. Density: 1 shell every 3 seconds on every 100-yard sector. Zone 2, communication trenches and support positions. Mix of high explosive and shrapnel shells from 75mm guns and 155mm howitzers. Goal: prevent reinforcement of front lines, isolate frontline defenders from support units, systematically destroy communication infrastructure, telephone lines, command posts, supply dumps. Zone 3, German artillery positions. Heavy shells from 155mm howitzers and French-provided heavy guns. Goal: immediate suppression of German artillery to prevent counterfire on American assault troops. This was counter-battery fire on an unprecedented scale. American artillery was attempting to silence German artillery across the entire sector. The coordination was extraordinary. Each battery followed a firing schedule calibrated to the minute. As frontline positions were pulverized, the barrage sifted systematically deeper: communication trenches, support trenches, reserve positions, assembly areas. The moving barrage created a rolling wall of destruction, advancing at exactly 100 meters every 4 minutes. German soldiers who survived described the experience in remarkably similar terms: helplessness. Lieutenant Friedrich Müller, 7th Bavarian Reserve Division, left a detailed account. Artillery bombardments were familiar. We'd endured British and French barrages that lasted days, but this was different, not in degree but in kind. The shells arrived with mechanical precision. No gaps, no pauses. Our dugouts collapsed, our communication trenches filled with bodies and debris. We couldn't signal headquarters, the telephone lines were gone. We couldn't see the enemy, the smoke was too thick. We couldn't hear commands, the noise was absolute. We couldn't think, the concussion from shells made thought impossible. We existed in a state of pure terror, waiting to die. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German defensive doctrine relied on disciplined fire from concealed positions, coordinated counterattacks, artillery support for defending troops. The American barrage made all of this impossible. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schmidt, commanding a company in the front lines, wrote in his post-war memoir, "My men were veterans: Verdun, Somme, Passchendaele. They'd held against attacks that cost tens of thousands of casualties. But on September 12th, within 2 hours of the American barrage beginning, half my company was casualties, and the rest were approaching psychological collapse. Not cowardice, dissolution. The sustained intensity broke something fundamental in men's ability to function. When the barrage lifted and American infantry appeared, my soldiers couldn't fight effectively. Their hands shook too badly to aim. They flinched at every sound. Some simply sat staring at nothing." At 500 hours, the barrage shifted forward. American infantry, 216,000 men in the first wave, advanced into the devastation. What they found shocked many of them: not fierce resistance, but surrender on mass scale. Entire German companies emerged from shattered dugouts with hands raised, stumbling through the shell craters in various states of shock. Officers who had commanded with authority for years couldn't maintain unit cohesion. Communication had completely collapsed. Battalion commanders didn't know where their companies were. Company commanders didn't know where their platoons were. Private John Lewis, 2nd Division, wrote in his diary, "We expected a fight. We had been told the Germans were experienced soldiers who would give ground slowly. What we found were men who looked like they had been to hell, bleeding from the ears, shaking, some crying. They surrendered by the dozens, by the hundreds. One airman officer tried to surrender his entire company to me personally, just a private. He kept saying Amerikanisch good and pointing to the sky, like our artillery had come from heaven. It was almost sad." The Samuel salient had been held by German forces for 4 years, a fortified position with layered defenses, concrete bunkers, extensive barbed wire, pre-registered artillery positions. It should have required weeks of fighting and tens of thousands of casualties to reduce. American forces captured the salient in 2 days, with approximately 7,000 casualties, remarkably light losses by Western Front standards. German forces suffered an estimated 22,000 casualties, with another 16,000 captured. More significantly, they lost cohesion across entire divisions. Units that had been rated excellent by German High Command required weeks of reconstitution before being considered combat-ready again. The German High Command recognized immediately what had happened. General Max von Galwitz, commanding the Army Group defending Samuel, wrote in his situation report, "The American artillery preparation achieved complete surprise and demonstrated organizational sophistication beyond what we anticipated from a new belligerent. The concentration of fire and precision of execution surpassed recent British and French efforts. Our defensive positions, which held against multiple French offenses in 1915-1916, were rendered untenable in 4 hours. The psychological effect on defending troops was catastrophic." If Samuel demonstrated the potential of centralized American artillery, Meuse-Argonne, launched 3 weeks later, demonstrated its full maturity. The Meuse-Argonne offensive involved 1.2 million American soldiers attacking the most heavily fortified sector of the Western Front, the Kriemhilde Stellung, part of the Hindenburg Line.
German defenses here were extraordinary. 4 years of engineering effort had created defensive positions considered nearly impregnable. The German high command knew the Americans were coming. They'd reinforced the sector, brought up reserves, positioned artillery for maximum effect. Unlike Samuel, surprise would be impossible. This would be a direct assault on prepared positions held by veteran German divisions. Colonel Billy Mitchell, commanding American Air Forces, later wrote, "The Germans knew we were coming and where we'd attack. Every factor favored the defense: terrain, fortifications, veteran troops, interior lines for reinforcement. If the Germans could stop us anywhere, it would be here." The artillery plan for Meuse-Argonne was even more ambitious than Samuel. Brigadier General McLaughlin, now commanding all American artillery for the offensive, concentrated 3,980 guns, the largest American artillery formation ever assembled until that point. But more than numbers, McLaughlin's plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of artillery employment. Phase 1. Suppression. 3-hour bombardment of German positions beginning at 0230 hours on September 26th. Unlike Samuel, this was announced. Germans would know the attack was coming, but the intensity would be so great that knowledge wouldn't matter. Phase 2. Counter-battery. 1/3 of American guns dedicated exclusively to suppressing German artillery. American aerial reconnaissance had mapped German battery positions. Counter-battery fire would target these systematically, attempting to establish artillery superiority before the infantry assault. Phase 3. Rolling barrage. As infantry advanced, artillery would provide a moving curtain of fire. But unlike earlier wars, this barrage would be flexible. Battery commanders could shift fire in response to infantry requests, concentrating on strong points that slowed advance. Phase 4. Interdiction. Heavy guns would target German communication routes, preventing reinforcement and resupply of frontline positions. The coordination required was staggering. 4,000 guns firing according to schedules that required split-second timing, communication networks linking hundreds of forward observers to fire direction centers, supply systems delivering millions of shells to hundreds of battery positions, maintenance crews keeping guns operational despite sustained firing that wore barrels, broke recoil mechanisms, and exhausted crews. Captain Truman, again commanding Battery D, described the opening barrage. At 0230 hours, we commenced firing. For 3 hours, we fired continuously, every gun in the battery working at maximum rate. The barrels got so hot we had to pause periodically to let them cool or risk explosions. The noise was indescribable. The ammunition expenditure was terrifying. We'd go through a day's worth of shells in an hour, and the supply trains kept bringing more. I'd never seen anything like it. Nobody had. German soldiers defending Meuse-Argonne weren't inexperienced conscripts. These were veteran formations. Many had fought on the Eastern Front against Russia, then transferred west for the 1918 spring offensives. They'd seen industrial-scale warfare at its worst. None of it prepared them for American artillery. Oberst Friedrich Freiherr von Eineten commanded a regiment in the 5th Bavarian Reserve Division, positioned in the Argonne Forest sector. His after-action report, preserved in German military archives, provides crucial insight into the German experience. The American bombardment beginning 0230 hours September 26th exceeded all previous experiences in intensity and coordination. Preliminary estimates suggested American forces had concentrated artillery at densities approaching those employed by French forces at Verdun. However, the employment of this artillery demonstrated sophistication we had not expected from American forces. Counter-battery fire began within minutes of the bombardment commencing, demonstrating excellent intelligence on our battery positions. Our artillery regiment attempted to return fire, but came under immediate suppression. Multiple batteries reported direct hits within the first hour, suggesting American forward observers or aerial reconnaissance had precisely located our positions. Frontline positions reported continuous bombardment with no gaps or pauses. Unlike French and British bombardments, which often showed poor coordination between batteries, creating safe zones troops could shelter, the American fire showed remarkable integration.
Every sector of our defenses received sustained attention. The psychological effect on troops was severe. Junior officers reported difficulty maintaining control as the bombardment continued. When American infantry advanced behind the rolling barrage, defensive fire was sporadic and poorly coordinated. Communication with battalion headquarters was impossible. Telephone lines destroyed. Runners unable to traverse the bombardment zone. My regimental command post received no reports from forward companies for 6 hours. When contact was re-established, 3 of 4 companies reported 50% casualties and severe unit cohesion problems. The German General Staff recognized the strategic implications immediately. On October 3rd, just 1 week into Meuse-Argonne, General Erich Ludendorff, effective commander of German forces, informed the German government that the war was lost and armistice negotiations should begin. Artillery wasn't the only factor in Ludendorff's calculation. The British offensive in Flanders, French advances across multiple sectors, the collapse of Germany's allies all contributed. But American artillery effectiveness at Meuse-Argonne demonstrated that Germany now faced 3 enemies capable of massing overwhelming firepower. Hauptmann Hermann Kron, German General Staff, wrote in his analysis, "The American artillery arm matured with frightening rapidity. In September 1918, American forces demonstrated artillery employment comparable to British and French forces who had refined their methods over 4 years of warfare. This acceleration, from virtually no modern artillery capability in 1917 to sophisticated employment in 1918, suggested that American forces would only grow more formidable. The strategic implications were devastating. We faced an enemy with unlimited industrial potential who was learning to employ that potential with systematic effectiveness."
Artillery in World War I wasn't just a destructive tool. It was a psychological weapon that broke armies from the inside. The numbers tell part of the story. Artillery caused approximately 70% of all casualties on the Western Front, but statistics alone don't capture the psychological impact of sustained bombardment. Dr. Thomas Salmon, American psychiatrist assigned to treat shell shock cases, conducted extensive interviews with soldiers evacuated from Meuse-Argonne. His reports provide insight into artillery's psychological effects. The distinctive characteristic of artillery bombardment is helplessness. Infantry combat, however terrifying, permits agency. Soldiers can shoot back, take cover, retreat, fight. Artillery bombardment removes all agency. Soldiers cannot see their attackers, cannot return fire effectively, cannot flee the impact zone. They must simply endure, knowing each shell might be the one that kills them. This helplessness produces specific psychological responses. Initially, hypervigilance and anxiety. After extended exposure, emotional numbing, dissociation, inability to process sensory information normally. Soldiers describe feeling hollowed out, existing in a fog where they perform actions mechanically without conscious thought. German prisoners displayed these symptoms with remarkable consistency. Even veteran soldiers showed signs of acute stress reaction, tremors, inability to maintain eye contact, exaggerated startle response, emotional volatility. Officers reported that many soldiers had lost the capacity for effective violence, not through conscious refusal, but through psychological disintegration of the aggressive impulse necessary for combat. The American artillery employment at Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne produced these effects at scale and at speed we had not previously documented. The combination of surprise at Saint-Mihiel and overwhelming intensity at both offensives compressed the timeline of psychological breakdown from days or weeks to hours. German military psychiatrists made similar observations. Dr. Ernst Rudin, working with German casualties from the American sector, noted, "The Americans have weaponized psychological collapse. Their artillery employment suggests systematic understanding of how sustained bombardment affects unit cohesion and individual soldier psychology. Whether this understanding emerged from theoretical study or empirical observation is unclear, but the application is deliberate and effective.
What made American artillery so devastatingly effective wasn't just numbers, it was integration. The technical innovations American artillery employed in 1918 seem mundane today, but were revolutionary then. Fire direction centers. Centralized coordination of all batteries within a core sector. Instead of individual batteries firing independently, a fire direction center received target requests, assigned batteries, calculated firing data, and coordinated timing. This allowed massing fires from dozens of batteries onto single targets in minutes. Standardized communications procedures. American forces implemented standardized communication procedures, codes, formats, priority systems, that allowed rapid transmission of fire orders. When infantry needed fire support, forward observers could request it using standard formats that fire direction centers understood immediately. Counter-battery doctrine. Systematic suppression of enemy artillery using dedicated counter-battery formations. American forces pioneered techniques combining aerial reconnaissance, sound ranging, using microphones to triangulate enemy gun positions, and flash spotting to locate German batteries, then assigned dedicated American batteries to suppress them. Barrage tables. Pre-calculated firing data for common scenarios allowed rapid engagement without time-consuming calculations. Battery commanders received barrage tables listing range, elevation, and charge for various target distances. They could commence firing within minutes of receiving orders. Ammunition logistics. American forces solved the ammunition supply problem through industrial-scale logistics. Ammunition trains ran continuously from depots to battery positions. Specialized loading equipment moved shells quickly. Forward dumps cached ammunition near guns. At peak operations, American artillery fired over 100,000 shells per day, a rate sustainable only through sophisticated logistics. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Summerall, commanding V Corps artillery, later wrote, "We didn't invent any of these techniques. French and British forces had developed them through painful experience. But we integrated them into a system that maximized their collective effect. The whole became greater than the sum of parts. Each innovation multiplied the effectiveness of others." The German General Staff reached the same conclusion. A post-armistice analysis of American artillery noted, American forces demonstrated no tactical innovations, but showed exceptional ability to synthesize Allied artillery methods into coherent doctrine and implement that doctrine at scale. This organizational competence, combined with American industrial capacity, produced artillery effectiveness that matched or exceeded the most sophisticated European armies, despite the Americans' minimal combat experience. American artillery effectiveness at Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne saved American lives. But efficiency in killing carries its own costs. The American offensives of autumn 1918 resulted in approximately 122,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, missing. Without effective artillery support, casualties would likely have been far higher. British and French offensives against similar German positions in earlier years had cost several times that number. But efficiency in killing doesn't spare the killers from psychological costs. Sergeant Alexander Wolcott, serving with American forces, wrote about artillerymen returning from Meuse-Argonne. The infantrymen who'd fought through shell-torn forests and machine gun nests had the expected 1,000-yard stare, the haunted look of men who'd seen things they couldn't unsee. But the artillerymen, who'd killed from miles away, who'd never seen their targets, who'd simply followed firing tables and pulled lanyards, they carried their own burden. They knew, intellectually, that each shell might have killed German soldiers, but the distance created a strange moral dissonance. They'd committed industrial-scale violence without personal violence. Some found this easier to bear than close combat. Others found it haunting precisely because of its abstraction. Captain Truman, reflecting on his artillery service decades later, was characteristically direct. "We fired thousands of shells during those weeks. I have no idea how many German soldiers died from my battery's fire. That ignorance is both a mercy and a burden. A mercy because I don't have to see their faces. A burden because I can imagine anything, and often do." The German casualties, killed, wounded, captured, numbered in the hundreds of thousands across the American sector. Many were conscripts, middle-aged men or teenagers pressed into service as Germany's manpower reserves evaporated. The American artillery killed them with industrial efficiency, not because individual American soldiers were more murderous than their enemies, but because the American system for organizing violence was more effective. There's no moral high ground in this efficiency. War is horror, and organized horror doesn't become less horrifying through competence. But the historical reality remains. American artillery effectiveness shortened the war, and a shorter war saved lives on all sides. General Ludendorff, in his post-war memoir, was frank. By October 1918, German forces could not sustain the attritional warfare that American artillery efficiency imposed. Each day of combat cost irreplaceable casualties we could not replace, destroyed equipment we could not repair, and consumed morale we could not restore. The mathematical logic was inexorable. The war had to end. The armistice came on November 11, 1918. American artillery had been employed in large-scale combat for exactly 8 weeks. San Miguel to armistice. In that brief period, American forces had evolved from artillery novices to practitioners of sophisticated combined arms warfare. The lessons learned at San Miguel and Meuse-Argonne became foundational to American military doctrine. The centralized artillery control that Marshall and McLachlan pioneered became standard practice. The Fire Direction Center concept evolved into the sophisticated fire support coordination systems the U.S. military employs today. The integration of intelligence, communication, and fire support became core competencies. But the human cost of that learning can't be reduced to doctrine. Thousands of American artillerymen served in France, firing millions of shells, killing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers they never saw. They returned home to a nation that celebrated victory, but couldn't comprehend what achieving that victory had required. The Germans who survived faced different challenges. Gefriede Klaus Reinhardt, who'd experienced the opening moments of San Miguel, returned to Germany in 1919. His letters to a fellow veteran described lasting psychological effects. "I cannot bear loud noises. Thunder sends me to the basement, trembling. I dream constantly of that September morning, the sound, the helplessness, the certainty I would die. 20 years later, the memory has not faded. If anything, it has intensified. The Americans broke something in me that morning. I don't think it can be fixed." Fort Sill, Oklahoma, 1936. 18 years after San Miguel, Colonel George Marshall, now a senior officer responsible for training and doctrine, visited the U.S. Army Field Artillery School. He'd been invited to lecture on operational planning, but the conversation inevitably turned to his role in developing American artillery doctrine during World War I. A young artillery officer asked the question that haunted Marshall. "Sir, when you planned San Miguel, did you know how effective it would be?" Marshall was quiet for a long moment. The other officers in the room recognized this pause. Marshall never spoke without considering his words carefully. "No," he finally said. "We understood the theory. We'd studied French and British methods. We'd done the calculations. But understanding theory and witnessing effect are different things. I visited the San Miguel battlefield 3 days after the assault. The destruction was comprehensive. Trenches reduced to overlapping craters, dugouts collapsed, equipment shattered, and scattered throughout, German soldiers, dead, wounded, captured, many of them showing signs of severe psychological trauma. I'd planned the operation that created this destruction. I'd coordinated the artillery concentration that killed these men. And I understood, seeing the result, that we'd created something new. Not new technology. The guns and shells were borrowed from the French, but a new application of technology at a scale and coordination level that changed the character of warfare." Marshall paused again, looking at the young officers. "You're learning to employ artillery with the effectiveness we demonstrated in 1918. That's necessary. If war comes again, our soldiers deserve competent leadership and effective support. But never forget that effectiveness in war means killing other human beings, often very young human beings who had no say in the political decisions that sent them to war. The artillery system we built destroyed German morale not because we were more moral or more justified, but because we were more organized. We systematized violence. We made killing efficient. That efficiency was necessary and saved American lives. But it remains killing, and the weight of that never entirely lifts. The room was silent. Marshall gathered his papers and prepared to leave, then turned back to the officers. The Germans at San Miguel feared American artillery because it represented something they couldn't counter, not superior courage or greater sacrifice, but superior organization. They feared the American capacity to take industrial methods and apply them to warfare with devastating effectiveness. They feared it because it worked, efficiently, consistently, devastatingly. They feared it because there was no counter except surrender.